Hello, thank you for joining us today. My name is Sheena Tomko, and I am a scientific outreach specialist at ClinEpiDB.org. The goal of our 2021 Spring Webinar Series is to really highlight high-quality epidemiological data sets that are available through our platform. To that end, we've invited Dr. Joaniter Nankabirwa to speak with us today about the PRISM studies and give us some insights into her research. Following her presentation, I will then use the ClinEpiDB website to demonstrate how you can explore the data she presented here to either recreate some of the PRISM team's findings or explore your own questions in the data. Before we start, I would like to point out that you can ask your own questions at any time by typing your question into the panel in the GoToWebinar control panel. It may look slightly different on your computer if you use a Windows machine rather than a Mac, but you should see something of this nature. In addition, if you prefer, at the end of the presentation and demo, we're going to have a live Q&A session with Dr. Nankabirwa. And at that time, you can choose to raise your hand using this icon, and we can unmute you so you can ask your question verbally if you prefer that instead of typing. Finally, I'd like to introduce Dr. Nankabirwa. So Joaniter is an infectious disease epidemiologist who's based at Malaria University in Uganda. Her PhD work was on intermittent preventative treatment for malaria in school-aged children, and she has since continued to work on malaria epidemiology studies. Today, she'll be speaking with us about her work on the PRISM project, specifically about work on 2 longitudinal cohort studies that were conducted in the same region in Uganda. Thanks, Joaniter.
Okay, hello everybody and welcome to this meeting. My name is Dr. Joaniter Nankabirwa and I'm presenting work from our Tororo studies entitled Malaria Transmission, Infection and Disease Following 5 Years of Sustained Indoor Residual Spraying in Tororo, Uganda. I'm making this presentation on behalf of the PRISM team. As means of introduction, Tororo is traditionally a high malaria transmission site, and entomological inoculation rate was estimated at 310 infective bites per person per year in 2011. In December 2014, indoor residual spraying was introduced in Tororo for the very first time. And to date, the district has had 9 rounds of IRS. The first 3 were with bendiocap, which was given every 6 months. This was followed by Actelic, which was given 5 rounds were rolled out, 1 round every year. And most recently, that is 2021, they've changed to Fludora. Tororo has also had 3 rounds of bednet distribution, the first occurring in 2013, the next in 2017, and most recently in 2020. So with this intensified malaria control interventions, it becomes important to continue with malaria surveillance and evaluate the impact of the control interventions on the disease burden in this setting. And so in this presentation, we provide a comprehensive description of the malaria burden in Tororo 5 years after IRS. And when I say 5 years after IRS, this cohort ran until October 2019. So it doesn't have the last bits of 2020 and 2021. So the objectives of the study were 1, to evaluate the impact of intensive vector control on clinical and entomological metrics in 2 cohort studies conducted in series. And then 2, to determine the epidemiology of malaria following the sustained vector control interventions. That is, I'm going to talk about both the IRS and the LLIN rollout. Briefly describing the cohorts or the study setting. As I said, Tororo is located in Uganda. In the top corner, we have a map of Uganda with Tororo in the eastern districts of Uganda. And this cohort was conducted in 1 sub-county called Nagongera sub-county. Prior to conducting the study, enumeration of all households was done in 2011 in Nagongera sub-county, and then we randomly selected the households to participate in the study. On the schematic below, it just shows the duration of the cohorts. As I said, we have had 2 cohorts, and I'm going to name them PRISM 1 and PRISM 2 for ease of reference. So PRISM 1 was started in August 2011. And by that time, the control interventions in Tororo were targeted LLIN distribution, which was focused on children and pregnant women and usually was through antenatal visits. As I said, in 2013, LLIN distribution, mass LLIN distribution was introduced in Tororo. Then towards the end of 2014, IRS with Bendio Camp, which is pink, was introduced in Tororo. The 3 rounds were given all the way to 2016. Then there was a change later on in 2016 to Actelic, which are the yellow bars. As I said, the cohorts ran up until 2019, October 2019. This table shows a brief description of the cohorts. I'm going to talk about PRISM 1, which ran between August 2011 to September 2017. Then I'll move to PRISM 2. And even when they are in the same setting, there were some slight changes in the cohorts. So PRISM 1 randomly selected 100 households and enrolled all children aged 0.5 to 10 years in the household. So the total enrollment across the years of follow-up was 385 children enrolled into this cohort. I want to say that this cohort was dynamic. And what does that mean? It means that when new children were born, they were enrolled into the cohort. When people left the household, they were excluded from the cohort. All children were followed up at a dedicated clinic for all their hospital needs, whether malaria-related or not malaria-related. And each participant received an LLIN at enrollment. Monitoring for malaria was by passive surveillance, and all participants who reported a recent history of fever, all who had an elevated temperature, had an urgent blood smear conducted, and if it tested positive, they were treated for malaria according to the national guidelines. The follow-up of PRISM 1 was 1 to 3 months. Initially, it was every 3 months, but towards the end of the cohort, it became a monthly follow-up. And measures of parastemia were, submicroscopic parastemia was by lamp. No membrane feeding was conducted in PRISM 1. However, entomological measures included conducting CDC light trap collections, which were in 1 room per house every month for a year. And then human landing catches, which happened in 8 houses every month for a year as well. Now, getting to PRISM 2, once PRISM 1 closed, we enrolled for PRISM 2. And this ran between October 2017 and 2019. In PRISM 2, 80 households, randomly selected households, were enrolled in the study. And unlike PRISM 1, in PRISM 2, all members of the households were enrolled into the cohort such that all age groups were captured in PRISM 2. And this was really based on lessons learned from PRISM 1, where we had some missing information just because we concentrated on certain age groups. The cohorts were also dynamic. And in total, we enrolled 531 participants in PRISM 2. Follow-up procedures at enrollment were the same, and also participants were seen at the same dedicated clinic. And similar to passive surveillance was conducted for all malaria episodes. Now, unlike PRISM 1, in PRISM 2, all follow-ups were every 28 days. And submicroscopic parastemia was monitored using, or was diagnosed using qPCR. In this cohort, membrane feeding was also conducted as part of the entomological measures. And this was done in participants who had a positive qPCR in the last routine visit. And CDC traps were collected every 14 days, unlike what we did in PRISM 1, and they were in all sleeping rooms. And in addition, human learning catches were in 16 households, unlike what we had for PRISM 1, where we had done the human learning catches only in where we had done the human learning catches only in 8 households. So we doubled the households. So looking at what we observed, this is looking at the temporal trends in malaria transmission. And with malaria transmission, I'm concentrating on the human biting rates and the entomological inoculation rates. This graph, the x-axis has the follow-up time, which is presented as the month and the year of follow-up from October 2011 all the way to October 2019. The y-axis on one side has the entomological inoculation measures, which are in terms of effective bites per person per year. While on the other side, we have the daily human biting rates. The red lines in the chart are human biting rates, while the black lines are the entomological inoculation rate, entomological inoculation rate measures. We also have the interventions in there with blue lines showing the times that mass LLIN distribution was conducted in 2013 and 2017. Then the other lines are showing when IRS was rolled out, time points when IRS was rolled out, first with the 3 rounds of Bendiocap, and then in this cohort, we had 4 out of the 5 rounds with Actelic. So what are we observing? Let's look at the entomological inoculation rates, the black lines, which are measured as effective bites per person per year. Before IRS, we find that the levels were high. In the cohort in this period before IRS, when we did the average measures, we had 218 effective bites per person per year at the beginning or before IRS. And distribution of ITNs showed, well, there was, when it happened, there was also declines. However, we observed that the rates go back almost to before IRS levels. Now, almost to before ITN distribution levels. Now, what happens when IRS is rolled out? When the first round of IRS was rolled out in 2014, we observed a significant reduction in the effective bites per person per year. And this continues or progresses all through the 5 years of sustained IRS, irrespective of the insecticide used. Similar trends were observed for the daily human biting rates. Looking at the actual numbers, what we observe is that for the human biting rates, before IRS, they were estimated at 34, and in the last 2 years of IRS, the PRISM 2, the rates had gone as low as 2.2 bites per person. Looking at the entomological inoculation rate, as I said before IRS, the average was estimated at, the times before IRS, the average was estimated at 218 effective bites per person per year. And by the last 2 years in PRISM 2, the entomological inoculation rate had significantly reduced to 0.42 effective bites per person per year. In the last 2 years, we also observed a change in biting behavior where we observed more outdoor biting and biting earlier in the evenings compared to what had been seen in the previous years. This is looking at the mosquito species. And on the x-axis, we still have the months and years of follow-up, while on the y-axis, this time we have the relative composition of the Anopheles species. So what are we observing? Before the onset of IRS or before IRS, we observe almost equal distribution of Arabiensis, Cambiensis, and Fenestans. And with the rollout of IRS, we see a mass decline in other species and the dominance of Anopheles arabiensis. And this was sustained all through the 5 years of IRS. The next is looking at the temporal trends in clinical malaria. And the presentation is going to restrict to the children aged 0.5 to 10 years to allow us to compare throughout the cohort. Then I'll talk about the other age groups later on. So what do we have on the x-axis? On the x-axis, we still have the month and year of follow-up. And then on the y-axis, we have the incidence of malaria per person per year. So before IRS in these children, what are we observing? we are observing a high incidence of malaria, almost 3 episodes, and sometimes going as high as 5 episodes per child per year. Again, looking at when bed nets were rolled out, the blue bar, almost no impact was observed. Slight decline in the incidence, very slight as you see it following the distribution of the first round of ITNs. Then when IRS is rolled out with Bendiocap, we observe a significant reduction in the incidence of malaria. And this is consistent throughout the 5 years of sustained IRS, with of course some times like in 2016 where we had an epidemic and slight increases in the incidence of malaria. Looking at it in terms of figures, before IRS, the incidence was estimated at almost 3 episodes per child per year. And in the last 2 years of follow-up, or in the last 2 years of PRISM 2, the incidence had gone so low to less than 1 episode per child per year. If you look at this, it is 0.05 episodes per child per year. This is children 0.5 years to 10 years. That is a great decline in incidence. The next one is looking at the prevalence of parasitemia. And I'm still concentrating on children 0.5 years to 10 years. X-axis still has the follow-up period, month and year. The y-axis this time is the proportion. And the lines, we have 2 lines in the graph. The blue line is for microscopic parasitemia, while the red line is for microscopic plus submicroscopic parasitemia. So what are we observing? We still have the bars to represent LLIN distribution as well as IRS. So what do we have before IRS? The prevalence of parasitemia, both microscopic and submicroscopic, were very high. For combination of microscopic plus submicroscopic, the incidence was going at sometimes as high as 78%, very high. What happened when bed nets were introduced in 2013? We observe a slight reduction in the prevalence, both of microscopic and when we combine the microscopic and submicroscopic parasitemia. And then in 2014, when IRS was introduced, we observed a gradual and then sustained reduction in the incidence of the prevalence of parasitemia. Of course, we have sometimes, like in 2016, where I said we had sort of an epidemic, failed to explain it, where we had some increases in the prevalence, but generally a gradual reduction. Interesting to note, at some months in the last years of follow-up, 2019, we had some months where we recorded actually 0, the prevalence of microscopic parasitemia as 0 in these children, 0.5 to 10 years of age. Now, putting this in terms of numbers, we observe that microscopic parasitemia reduced from 34.9, or can I say 35%, all the way to less than 2%, while a combination of microscopic and submicroscopic parasitemia changed from almost 70% to less than 10%. Very, very impressive. Looking at other metrics, and I'm going to talk about severe malaria. I should say that this was a cohort where we monitored or treated participants for all their clinical complaints. So it may not be representative of all of Tororo with these values that you're seeing. But looking at severe malaria, in these cohorts, before IRS, we had 3 episodes of severe malaria. While when IRS was rolled out, we had no episode of severe malaria. In these cohorts, we also had no deaths, whether before or after IRS, that were due to malaria. And I should say that we conducted audit and so many things to try and establish causes of death in the few deaths that we had. None of these deaths was due to malaria. Prevalence of anemia, and I'm going to define this based on what we have in the malaria indicator survey as HB less than 11 grams per deciliter. We observed a reduction in the prevalence of anemia from 34.6% all the way to 5.1%. Interesting to note that we also observed a reduction in non-malarial febrile illnesses from 3 episodes per child per year to less than 1 episode per child per year. So even when we thought IRS should ideally target the malarial illnesses, we observed that even the non-malarial illnesses reduced. And then with the reduction of the non-malarial illnesses, we also observed a reduction in the antibiotic therapies, incidence of antibiotic therapies given to the study participants, taking note that the study participants were seen by the same doctors throughout the 2 cohorts. So previously, for comparison purposes, I've been concentrating on children 0.5 to 10 years to allow us compare between the PRISM 1 and PRISM 2. For the next presentation, I'm going to concentrate on PRISM 2, where we had all age groups in the cohort. So PRISM 2, as I said, was the last 2 years of follow-up, 2017, end of 2017 to 2019. So I'm looking at the incidence of malaria stratified by age. This is the last 2 years of follow-up. Throughout the 2 years of follow-up, for the 531 participants, we only had 38 episodes of clinical malaria. That is parasthenia with fever, 38 episodes. And no participant had malaria more than once. And if you remember back, we also had no participant having severe malaria in this cohort. Looking at how it was distributed by age groups, interesting to note, or as opposed to what we have been previously observing in high transmission areas. In these last 2 years, we observed that children under 5 and children 5 to 15 years almost had similar episodes of malaria. Actually, I should say that we had slightly higher episodes in children 5 to 15 years compared to under 5s, as opposed to what we typically observe in high transmission areas. For the adults, similar trends from what we were expecting were observed. Looking at parasite prevalence, we observed that children 5 to 15 years had higher prevalences of parasthenia, and this was estimated at around 3.3%. And children under, this was followed by children under 5, then the adults. Taking note that we usually find higher clinical episodes in children under 5 and higher prevalence of parasthenia in 5 to 15 or the school age children as well as the adults. So there was a slight change here where the children under 5 had higher prevalences of parasthenia than the adults. Looking at the parasite densities, the children under 5 had higher parasite densities, while the children 5 to 15 and the adults had almost similar parasite densities. The first was microscopic. Now, this is a combination of microscopic plus submicroscopic. When we combined the two, still children 5 to 15 had higher prevalences of parasthenia, estimated at 14%. But unlike what we observed for microscopic parasthenia, the adults had the next highest levels of prevalence of parasthenia, and then the children had less. This is the typical observation that we expect in a high transmission site, although we are seeing lower levels than typically what we had in Tororo prior to this. And the geometric means when we combine microscopic and submicroscopic, highest in children under 5, followed by 5 to 15, then the adults. So in summary, we observe significant reductions in the measures of malaria transmission following sustained IRS in Tororo. we see reductions in transmission with over a 500-fold reduction in the entomological inoculation rates. And as I said, we've seen a shift to arabiensis, outdoor biting, and earlier biting in the last 2 years of the follow-up. We also observe a more than 50% reduction in the incidence of malaria. And I should say the last cases of severe malaria were diagnosed before IRS. Then looking at measures of infection, we also observe over a 10-fold reduction in the prevalence of parastemia. And for other illnesses, we observe an overall reduction in the prevalence of anemia and non-febrile malaria illnesses, with a reduction in non-antibiotic therapies. However, despite the reduction in the disease burden, we observe a significant proportion of the population remained parastemic. Overall prevalence of parastemia in the last 2 days was 10%. And when we look at children, school-age children, it was actually 14%. So this prevalence was highest in older children at 14% and adults at 10%. And majority of these infections are submicroscopic, meaning that we would not routinely identify these infections. Unfortunately, if we have infections in the community, even with reduction in disease, these infections provide a potential reservoir for malaria, onward malaria transmission. And so these results bring up some questions. What would be the ideal IRS exit strategies? We found that we can't give IRS forever. It's very expensive. In Uganda, it is for now limited to only 14 districts, which is less than 5% of the districts. But what would be if we had to leave IRS, as is being suggested in the last few discussions because of the costs? What would be the ideal exit strategy, taking note that we have some microscopic infections that may actually lead to resurgence, as was observed when it was stopped in northern Uganda. And then we are thinking of potential benefits of targeting this infectious reservoir using chemoprevention. This has not been widely explored, but I'm happy to say that we are doing some analysis and modeling to see what the impact of chemoprevention would do on this infectious reservoir. Thank you for listening to me. I want to thank the different teams that have supported this work, the PRISM study team, plus all the collaborators, the infectious diseases research collaboration where the work is based, the key stakeholders, Ministry of Health and all other stakeholders that have supported this work, our funding, which is mainly coming from different grants from NIH, the study participants. Thank you.
Thank you, Joaniter, for a really great presentation on the very striking findings you saw post introduction of IRS in Uganda. So for the next section of today's webinar, I will be showing how to access the PRISM data that Joaniter was just describing through ClinEpiDB.org. So here from the homepage, we can simply search for PRISM and see that there are 2 studies represented here. One includes data from 3 sites in Uganda from 2011 to 2017. And the other includes data from 1 site in Uganda from 2017 to 2019. Now, if you remember from the start of Joaniter's presentation, she mentioned that there were some methodological differences in terms of who they were collecting data from and also how frequently they were collecting data between these 2 data sets. And this is why they're represented separately rather than as just one study, one continuous study. So if we click the name here, I'm right-clicking to open in a new tab. We come to the study page. And this page is a treasure trove of information that will help you understand how the study was conducted. So at the top, towards the top of the page, you'll be able to find associated publications and look at those. And then further down, you'll see the main objectives of the study, as well as information about where the study was conducted. So we can see here that one of the study sites was in Nagagera, which includes Tororo district. And then dates of data collection, as well as more specific information about things like the eligibility criteria. So in this case, they were enrolling children who are 6 months to 10 years old, as well as up to 1 primary caregiver from each household. and more information such as what types of variables were being collected, how data was being collected, and in some cases, case report forms, data dictionaries, protocols, and informed consent forms as made available by the study team. So there's one other thing I want to point out on this page, which is the data versions table. And this is particularly useful if you happen to look at a data set and then come back, say 6 months later and realize that things don't look quite as you remembered them. If you think that there's might have been a change in the data, you can actually come here, and data can change for any number of reasons. It might be that someone spotted a mistake in the data and that mistake was fixed, or it could be something more innocuous, like in this case, version 2 included the addition of 1 year's worth of data just from the Ngangara Tororo district. And then, other things might not even be noticeable to you as a user. For instance, anytime we update our ontology mappings or IRIs, usually people are only looking at the labels of those terms and not the identifiers themselves, so they don't even notice those changes. So going back up to the top of the study page, we can access the data through any of these icons here. And to start with, we're going to take a look at some of the entomology data. So from this slide, this is a slide that Joaniter showed during her presentation. And what you see here again is that the infective bites per person per year and the daily human biting rate have a huge range before IRS was started. But after IRS, you see a significant drop and you never quite see those peaks you saw before IRS, either in the first 3 years of IRS or the last 2 years of IRS, which represents the PRISM 2 cohort study. So let's take a look and see what we can find in ClinEpiDB. So before we do that, just note that these types of variables, infective bites per person per year, are calculated variables. And so this usually involves a calculation plus multiple original variables. So we might not actually be able to look at this specifically, but we can look at maybe one thing that contributes to these calculations, which is the total number of mosquitoes over time. So going back to the PRISM cohort page, each of these, as I mentioned before, represents a different way to access the data. And so if you click this person icon, you'll be entering the data where the level of analysis is at the participant level. The stethoscope means you'll look at the data at the level of an observation. And so one person can have multiple observations per study, since this is a longitudinal cohort study. This house icon will have the level of analysis will be households, and one household can contain multiple participants. And finally, the entomology collections, this bug icon lets you look at the light trap data, so the mosquito data. And that's where we're going to start today in today's demo. So here I've opened up a new search using entomology collection data, and this is with the PRISM 1 cohort study. And so remember, there's 3 different sites in this study, and we are interested specifically in the Ngangara data, which includes Tororo district. So here I've subsetted the data by selecting Ngangara to include only the data going forward from this region of Uganda. So instead of looking at 17,000 different entomology collections, we're going to look at around 6,000 entomology collections. I can then click through variables in any of these steps, but I'm particularly interested in the entomology collection variables. So we'll skip down here. And the first variable that appears when I click on that is the collection date variable. And what you'll see is that this data, because it's continuous, is presented as a histogram, where pink is the data that's coming from my subset. So the pink data is the data from Ngangara specifically, and gray is the rest of the data coming from the other 2 study sites. So we can see here, if we look over time, that data was collected from Ngangara pretty much throughout the entire study period. And if we look at the last year specifically, you can tell that data was only collected in Ngangara and not in any of the other study sites, because there's no additional gray here during the last year of the study. These histograms can be configured so you can look at a certain range on the x-axis or y-axis if you so choose, and you can also alter the bin width. So if instead of looking at every day, I want to look at every week, it binned by every week, I can do that instead. So variables that were collected from mosquito traps include things like the total number of female anopheles in each light trap that was done. And we can see here an overall at the top, a min, a mean, median, and max values for how many mosquitoes were ever captured. And you can see there's a heavy left skew in this data. So most light traps had 0 or very few anopheles captured, whereas at least one had over 1,000 mosquitoes that were captured in that one light trap, which sounds a little horrifying to me, to be honest. So going back to collection date, if we want to compare how female anopheles counts varied over time, one way in which we can do it is to simply select the range of data we're interested in and look at that range, and then select a second range of data and compare it. So here, if we do a rough selection, it looks like from Joaniter's plot that IRS was started sometime around November of 2014. So in this search, let's go ahead and look through the end of October 2014. So now if we go to the anopheles count, we can see we have a mean value of 35.13 and a median of 10.5. If I then go back and select, instead of this pre-IRS period, the post-initiation of IRS period, and then look at the anopheles count, we can see that the mean has dropped from over 30 to just 3.17, and the median has dropped to 0. We also see the max is much lower than 1,000. It's now only 146. So this is one way to look at that, and it is indicative of the fact that there is a drop in terms of the numbers of mosquitoes after IRS is started. And we could do the same in the PRISM 2 cohort. We can do an entomology search. In this case, data was only collected from one region, so we don't need to subset the data based on where it was collected. And in addition, we don't need to subset when data was collected because this is the entire end 2-year period. And we can instead look simply at the female anopheles count and see the mean now is even slightly lower at 2.07 compared to the previous one. So this is one way to look at this data, but I want to spend some time now highlighting actually how you can look at the same data through one of our partner websites, VectorBase. So ClinEpiDB is part of the ViewPathDB project, and this project encompasses a number of websites, each of which is linked here at the bottom of all of our web pages. And in particular, this audience may be interested in PlasmoDB, which is a genomics resource for Plasmodium researchers, and then VectorBase, which is a genomics resource for vector researchers, which in this case would be the mosquitoes. So if we click this VectorBase icon, we're taken to the VectorBase website, and I want to spend some time highlighting this map view tool, because this is a tool that not only is a pretty powerful tool for looking at population level data in VectorBase, but we're also in the process of actually integrating this tool into ClinEpiDB so you can use it on human data too. So here, what we can do is search specifically for data from the PRISM studies. And in this case, the data is split into 3 different projects, which are really just based on how the data was published. Okay, so now that I've selected the 3 PRISM projects, we see that instead of having markers all around the world, we only see a few markers that are in Uganda. And these 3 markers represent the 3 different study sites that were from the PRISM 1 study. Instead of looking at samples, let's change to look at abundance data, because that's what we're really interested in here. And now we can see, that if you click on one of these points, you get a nice donut chart of the data. And here we can see that 80% of all the mosquitoes identified in this region of Uganda are from Anopheles gambiae sensu stricto, and I apologize if I pronounced that incorrectly, as the species type. And as we go from more northeast to more southwest, we see that the proportion of Anopheles gambiae sensu stricto increases as you move southwest. So there's 3 different sites, but we're particularly interested in this more northeastern site because this is where Nagangara, where Tororo district is. So in addition to seeing a donut chart of the species distributions, we can actually also see the data over time, which is a really powerful way to look at it. And here what we can see is prior to introduction of IRS around this time here, we see these nice peaks in mosquito abundance and troughs throughout the year. And this is similar to what Joaniter showed us in terms of the infective bites per person year and daily human biting rate. The other thing, and so what's really striking here is once IRS is started, you never get peaks anywhere near these levels in the later years. Another thing that's pretty striking is you can see that there's a significant population shift from prior to IRS to especially the last 2 years after IRS was initiated. And that's represented by these different colors represent the different species. And so you can see that there's a species shift from whatever purple and red represent to this blue and green. So as I mentioned before, this is a very neat tool that we hope to show in ClinEpiDB within the next few months as well. Okay, so going back to ClinEpi, one of the other things that, this is another slide from Joaniter's presentation. So one of the other things that she quite nicely highlighted was a significant drop in parasite prevalence once IRS was introduced in pink. And so here there's two different measurements. One in blue is the microscopic parasitemia, and in red it's a proportion of people with not only microscopic but also submicroscopic parasitemia. And this is broken down into percentages here. So we can look at this in ClinEpiDB as well. And in this case, instead of doing an entomology search, let's do an observation search because we're looking for malaria prevalence over time. So by clicking the stethoscope icon, I've started a search, and we can see that in total, there's over 48,000 observations of people that were performed during the PRISM 1 cohort. We are going to limit this just to data from Tororo district by selecting Nagangara, which is the higher level sub-county. And we see now that there's only 23,000 observations. So if I wanted, I could go through, I could look at the association with sex and see, that there's slightly more females than males enrolled, which makes sense given that there was one usually female caregiver enrolled along with the children. And I could look at other variables that I might be interested in, such as maybe what the roof materials were or what type of windows or screens they had available in their homes to keep mosquitoes out, things of that nature. But for this example, we are specifically interested in the microscopic parasitemia, so whether or not people were found to have Plasmodium by microscopy. By typing keywords into the search bar at the top, I can actually see a list of potential associated variables and click to go directly to a variable of interest. And at this point, I want to take just a minute to explain how to read these tables for categorical variables. So in this column here, we get the total counts of all values for the variable. So of the original 48,000, over 48,000 observations, 42,000, close to 43,000 of those actually had blood smear data that were either negative or positive. In this column, just to the left of it, we have what's called the remaining observations. So these are the total counts for my specific subset of interest. So in this case, these are the counts for the Nagangara subcounty specifically. And we can see that they had 74% of their blood smears were negative and 26% of their blood smears were positive. Great. So now that we can identify, the total prevalence of microscopy, we can start breaking it down by observation dates, similar to what we did with the entomology data just now. So by going to the visit date variable, I can roughly select the time period that was pre-IRS, or I could more specifically select it here. And then I can jump back to this variable and see the updated data. So now I can see that pre-IRS, roughly 34% of blood smears came back positive. And this is a pretty close match to what Joaniter presented during her talk. If we then, if we then switch instead to look at data after IRS was initiated, and again, this is just a rough selection here, we can now see that the percent positive has declined to 16%, which is a little bit higher than what Joaniter presented, but not too far off. And then if we wanted to look at 4 to 5 years after IRS was initiated, we could go to the PRISM 2 cohort, do an observation level search, and look at these same variables. So again, in this case, we don't need to apply any subsets, and we can just look straight at the Plasmodium asexual stages by microscopy variable and see only 2% of blood smears were positive as time went on. And this very closely matches what she presented. So this is one way to look at the data, but we have another way that makes it actually easier to see a plot that's more similar to what she presented here. And I'm going to take some time to show that to you now. So from this search here, if you click on this button at the end, the view observations, this takes you to what we call our results page. And from here, you can either download the data and specifically select variables that you're interested in to download, or you can go to the visualization apps and choose to make a visualization. We have 3 at the moment. One is the distributions app, where you can make either a histogram or bar chart, and you can stratify by other variables as needed. 2x2 contingency table, and then this data summaries app, which for longitudinal cohort studies like PRISM lets you look at the data as a time series. So we're going to use this data summaries app to try and recreate Joaniter's graph. So here, we're going to include data from all visits and for all age ranges. And what we really want to do is set the y-axis to that same variable we were looking at before. So whether the blood smear was positive for microscopy. And we want to view this as a proportion. So we're going to look at, on the y-axis, the total proportion of positive tests out of all tests by microscopy. And then we're going to leave this as is. So we're going to stratify the data based on which sub-county in Uganda the participant came from, because we're specifically interested in the Tororo data. So now if I click on summary statistics, I get these nice tables, which lets me know the size of my data. And then if I switch to plot, I get an actual graphical representation. So here we see 3 different lines, one for each of the study sites. And by clicking on the line in the legend, I can actually add or remove that particular study site from my plot. So now we're looking at only data from Nagangara subcounty, Tororo district. And we can see that over time, at the beginning of the study, we see that there was about 30 to 40% parasite prevalence in this community. Whereas once IRS was introduced somewhere around here, there's a very sharp decline, and parasite prevalence decreases to more like 10%. And then we can do the same with the PRISM 2 data. So here in the PRISM 2 cohort, we can go on to look at the final data, analyze results, data summaries app. And again, we can set the variable to that microscopy variable. And here we want the proportion of where this was yes, the blood smears were yes. And in this case, we don't need to stratify by sub-county because everything was done in Nagangara. So now we get this plot where we can see what looks to be a very sharp increase at first and then sharp decline and then somewhat stable. But if we look at this y-axis, we see that the data, the proportion of people parasitemic by microscopy doesn't even reach 10% here. So this axis is very different than the one presented here where it's going down to around 10%. So this does match this. It's not an exact match because the way these plots are drawn is different. They use different code on the back end, but you can see that before IRS, you see around 30 to 40% prevalence, and after IRS is introduced, it drops down to around 10%. And in the last 2 years of IRS, it drops even further down. So if I wanted to, depending on my interests, I could either explore this further. I could stratify, for instance, by I could stratify by sex or by some other feature that I'm particularly interested in on this plot, or I could explore completely separate potential variable associations depending on my interests. So here, just a quick stratification, and it looks like there might be slightly more male infections than female, but who knows if this is really significant or not. But other things I could look at would be things like the associations between environmental risk factors like standing water with the incidence of malaria, or I could look at febrile illness over time, not looking specifically at malaria, but just any indication of fever. These are other things I could do when exploring the data. And so in summary, you can use ClinEpiDB.org to review study documentation, explore study data, quickly recreate key study findings, like in this case, the decrease in Plasmodium prevalence following introduction of IRS. You can generate new hypotheses for further exploration, and you can also download the data to perform more robust statistical analyses on your own using your favorite statistical software. So as you're using the website, please always feel free to contact us at ClinEpiDB.org with any questions. And so before we go into the Q&A session, I just want to highlight that we have 2 more webinars that are coming up over the next 3 weeks. Next week, we will be hearing from Annie and Upasana about data from the India isomer from the Meghalaya region, which is in northeast India. And then 2 weeks later, our final presentation will be from Lulu Muhe, who will be speaking about data from the SIP study, which is a study of preterm infants that was conducted in Ethiopia. And so now, as we go into the Q&A session, I just want to remind you that you can type your questions through this section of the GoToWebinar control panel. And if you prefer, you can also click to raise your hand, and we will then unmute you so you can ask your question.
So thanks, Sheena and Joaniter. That was a really informative presentation. So we have a few questions about the execution of the IRS spraying. So we have a question about why did the frequency of IRS change from every 6 months to every year? And also, why did the insecticide change from bendiocarb to actelic over the course of the study?
Okay, thank you very much. This is Joaniter, and I'm happy to respond to the questions. The two are closely related because one explains the other. So in Uganda, we have routine insecticide resistance studies, really to monitor if you're having any resistance to insecticides that are being used. And this inform the insecticide use. So we will find that at certain intervals, they have to change insecticides if any resistance is detected. And so the changes from bendiocarb to actelic is actually because to prevent increased resistance to the bendiocarb. And as we know, actelic has a longer half-life than bendiocarb. Bendiocarb is around 6 months, while actelic gets to around 1 year. And that explains why there is also change from 6 months with bendiocarb to yearly with actelic. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And then we had another question about whether or not you surveyed the participants' satisfaction with the bed nets and the IRS spraying. Would the participants be happy using these interventions over the long term? And are there any concerns about chronic exposure to insecticides when they're sprayed indoors?
Thank you very much. We actually did participant satisfaction, and as you noticed in Tororo, the transmission was very high. And by the end of this follow-up, they observed that it had actually greatly reduced, and everybody appreciated the fact that there was a reduction in transmission. One time you bombarded by mosquitoes and you're already sick, then the next few years you're fine and not going to hospital. So everybody was excited about the interventions. I should say the interventions are still ongoing. We had our last spraying in March 2021, and hopefully we shall continue for some time. Now, so there was very limited resistance to the spraying, and actually household heads would follow up with the necessary bodies when they missed a round of spraying, so that they ensured that they were sprayed. Now, bed nets, they also like the bed nets, but I should say our data shows that once the mosquito populations went down, the use of bed nets also went down. We find that adherence to use reported was still high because of course we've had the cohort for quite long, and I think they know what we are expecting, so there's a report bias. But in addition to reported bed net use, we went ahead and did sudden home visits to just see if the nets were up. And with those visits, we found that actually the use as observed was very low, less than 50%, even when they had the bed nets. So even when they are happy to have the bed nets from their reports, it seems like when the mosquito densities went down, they also reduced the use. And reasons they were reporting is because it's hot, because they don't need them anymore, because they are not getting any mosquitoes in their households, as the main reasons for non-use. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And so I think that answer ties into this next question a bit. So the next question is, you showed little impact of ITN when EIR was high. Do you think that ITNs would be more effective once the Anopheles gambiae population has been reduced by spraying? So it sounds like it's going to be both an uptake question and an effectiveness question. So if you could speak a little bit on that.
Yeah, so as I've said, with reduced populations, we've seen that uptake or use is going down. So effectiveness, of course, if you do not use, then effectiveness goes down. I should also say we have a scenario in northern Uganda where next IRS was rolled out, and after around 3 rounds of IRS, it was stopped, and they had mass bed net distribution and had hoped that the bed net distribution would improve, would sustain the benefits of IRS that had been observed. Unfortunately, by the end of 4 months, by 4 months following the spraying, the malaria burden went back up. The test positivity rates were going as high. We didn't have a cohort there, so the best we can use is the hospital data. The test positivity rates were going up, and the mosquito densities were also going up. And by 1 year, we had the levels of test positivity rates, so the burden as high as the pre-IRS status, or even higher in some areas. So even with the bed nets, the effectiveness was not as well as we had expected. Now, if we translate that data to this area where the mosquitoes have gone down, adherence to bed net use is down, I'm sure that the effectiveness will be very low. And so that's why those questions on we have a reservoir, what would be the strategy, exit strategy? Because for sure, bed nets as an exit strategy has not worked in Uganda. Thank you.
Yep, thanks, that makes sense. And then one final question before we go, this is for Sheena. Is it possible to use the data in ClinEpiDB to determine whether bed nets were more effective pre-IRS in households with fewer mosquitoes?
That's a good question. I think it might be possible. So I think if you did an entomology search, you should still have access to data such as reported bed net usage, although as Joaniter pointed out, reported use doesn't always track closely with actual use, but you could take a look at associations between the use of bed nets and then the counts of mosquitoes as well, and try and get at the question that way.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think we have some more playing around to do on the ClinEpi website on our own, and maybe we can figure that out. So thanks everyone for your attention. Thanks so much to Joaniter and Sheena for great presentations today, and please join us next week. Bye.
Bye.